This is episode 97 of That Shakespeare Life. This episode is brought to you in part by Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation App, the only audio Shakespeare pronunciation app which is designed to remove fears about how to speak Shakespeare's language so that his plays are accessible to everyone. Find out more about this app in today's show notes and stay tuned after the episode for how you can learn more.
Hi, I'm Amy Lidster, postdoctoral research fellow at King's College London. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Now, to suspend them over the stage, there definitely was the technology to do that. The London stages had houses above the stage, and from those houses they lowered and raised lots of objects and people.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Ben Jonson staged a masque at court called The Fortunate Isles, which begins with a spirit descending into the audience featuring a floating island so elaborately constructed that England's premier architectural professional, Inigo Jones, who is the designer behind Whitehall Palace, Banqueting House, and Covent Garden Square, was hired to construct an apparatus specifically for this performance. While records do not detail the construction of this magical floating island, we know from various accounts that it was impressive in its scope and execution. So what does this mean for William Shakespeare? We know from Shakespeare's plays that the bard includes very similar items in his plays as well, from magical floating islands and gods riding on dolphins in plays like Twelfth Night to Shakespeare's Cymbeline, where there is a stage direction that almost mirrors what we know happened in Jonson's Masque, when the text of Cymbeline says, quote, "Jupiter descends in thunder and lightning, sitting upon an eagle," end quote. When these fantastic elements are used in the text, does that mean Shakespeare could have had an architectural designer build an elaborate floating island or a descending eagle befitted with thunder and lightning inside the Globe Theatre? Traditional theater research into Elizabethan staging suggests that the set and scenery for this play would have been so sparse that the production relied on the strength of the dialogue alone to convey the elaborate and fantastic parts of the story. But if that's the case, why did Shakespeare map out Jupiter's descent in the stage directions with such precision? Could Shakespeare have used elaborate props and circus-like movable scenery? Our guest, Dr. Michael Hirrel, believes the answer is yes. Mike is a lawyer who did commercial litigation mainly concerning the telecommunications industry for 40 years. He's retired now, and although he does still take on a pro bono case or two that concern environmental protection, mainly he's now a full-time Shakespeare scholar. This is something he's done at least part-time for his whole career, and today he's interested in the literary and early stage history of Elizabethan period plays. He's written scholarly articles for journals like Shakespeare Quarterly, Review of English Studies, and Huntington Library Quarterly, plus a chapter in the book Lost Plays in Shakespeare's England. He's spoken at several scholarly conferences, and he's finishing a book about the lost predecessor play of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Mike's latest research compiles strong evidence to suggest that we may be wrong in assuming Shakespeare's plays were sparse in their set design, and that instead, they may have been quite technically impressive in the execution of elaborate staging, props, and scenery. Records from Henslow's diary indicate a dragon and hell's mouth, along with a tomb in the entire city of Rome, were constructed on stage with enough substance that Henslow included it as an item in his records of theater inventory. We are delighted to have Mike with us today to share with us what these records and others reveal about how Shakespeare might have executed his set designs as well. Hello, Mike. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Cassidy. It's a pleasure to be here.
What was it about the actor Edward Alleyn, who played Faustus in the play Dr. Faustus, that made you believe the reference to Hell's Mouth found in Henslow's diary had to have been a large opening on the stage?
Susan Terrasano has shown in a couple of articles back, I was in the 1996 or so. One of them was in Shakespeare Quarterly, and the other one she authored a catalog for an exhibition at Dulwich College about Edward Alleyn. And she showed with lots of references and by careful analysis of his portrait which is at Dulwich College, that he was quite tall, unusually tall for his age. He might not seem that tall today, but people in general were shorter then. At the end of Faustus, of course, the devils drag Faustus down into hell, and Faustus shouts out in horror, "Ugly hell, gape not." But they drag him down anyway, unfortunately, because that was the deal that he made. And so in Henslow's inventories, there's a hell's mouth. So presumably that was set over the trap door, and that was Edward Allen playing Faustus was dragged through that. It had to be big, it had to be high because he was tall.
In his research, Mike calls attention to the dragon chariot in Dr. Faustus, as well as the reference to Phaeton's chariot from Henslow's diary, saying they were, quote, presumably rigged to fly over the stage. Now, Mike, how would that have been accomplished? Did they have this kind of technology in Elizabethan theater to have objects fly over the stage during a performance?
I'm not sure, Cassidy. I've been rethinking that since I gave my speech. I was trying to think, how would they actually make it fly laterally across the stage? And that, I think, might have been difficult. I'm not sure they could have done that. The text is clear, both the A text and the B text, that they are flying over Europe and then over Italy and then particularly over Rome before they actually set down. It could be that Wagner or the chorus are just saying that. They're just describing it, and it's not actually being represented. But there are properties in Henslow's property inventory that suggest, no, they were actual things. There's a chain of dragons, and there's also a dragon chariot, so which also matches up pretty well with the two texts. The A text has, they're being drawn across Europe. It says they're being drawn up by yoky dragons' necks. And in the B text, they're riding on the back of a dragon. So you would think that both the chain of dragons and the dragon chariot were suspended over the stage. They may not have moved laterally, so I'm sort of thinking now that they were just suspended over the stage and that the actors pretended, and somehow they got the illusion of motion from the suspension. Now, to suspend them over the stage, there definitely was the technology to do that. The London stages had houses above the stage, and from those houses, they lowered and raised lots of objects and people. In Cymbeline, as you say, Jupiter descends from the heavens, he throws out thunderbolts, which must have been actual fireworks, and there's many other ones. He's descending on an eagle in that case. And then at about the same time, Heywood's Golden Age has Jupiter ascending to heaven on an eagle as well. So that was the Queen Anne's men, and they were playing in the Red Bull Theater. So we could see here that both the Rose and the Red Bull had that capability. And of course, so did the Globe, because Jupiter descends from the heavens in Cymbeline. They also lowered objects, like thrones would come down with people on them. So it would have been easy enough to lower the dragon chariot, and before that, the chain of dragons themselves, and then just suspend it there. They must have had a winch up in the upper house and with a ratchet where they could just ratchet it down. They wouldn't risk breaking Richard Burbidge's neck by trying to hold onto a rope. They would have had a winch with a ratchet. So it would have been suspended above the stage, and then I guess the city of Rome would appear beneath them. Perhaps it was moving, or perhaps the actors just pretended to be looking at it moving and imitated the appearance of motion. That was a long answer, but that's the best I could do.
It's beautiful imagining all of these things, and especially that they were able to lower a throne with an actual actor on the throne. I can only imagine how spectacular that would have been to see. And several of these elaborate props in Henslow's diary are for the Lord Admiral's men specifically. Mike, was there a difference among the level of elaborate props that varied depending on the income from various patrons? You mentioned the Red Bull versus the Rose versus the Globe, and as well as Queen Anne's men versus Lord Admiral's men. Were all Elizabethan theaters using elaborate scenery, or did that depend on where their income was coming from?
I don't think it would have depended on their income, Cassidy, because they were competing with each other. And to the extent they needed to compete over spectacular effects, I mean, no matter what their income, they still had to offer the same kind of effects that the other companies were. It's possible that different companies had different levels of spectacular effects. I mean, I've argued elsewhere that people who went to Lord Chamberlain's and King's Company plays tended to want plays with more intellectual content in them, which isn't universally true. I mean, they also performed Musidorus, for example, which has no intellectual content whatever. So it's not an invariable role, but there could have been different styles of presentations and different expectations from the audiences. On the whole, though, I'm inclined to think that they would have all had a lot of special effects. And as I mentioned, we have these descents and ascents, not just, Jupiter comes down on an eagle and throws out thunderbolts in Cymbeline, and that's a King's Company play. And obviously, the Golden Age was a Queen Anne's Company play. And of course, obviously, Faustus was a Lord Admiral's Company play. So they're all using these ascents and descents from the heavens. I would suspect then that all the companies had similar effects. The difference with the Lord Admiral's Company is that we have Henslow's properties list, so we can see there that they had rather elaborate props. The property list isn't complete. We don't really know why it's not complete, but just by looking at it, you can see all manner of truly spectacular props.
When researching stage props for Shakespeare productions, Mike compares the portraits that appear in Hamlet with the ones that appear in, quote, Hamlet. Mike, for the uninitiated, please explain what Hamlet means.
Hamlet, that's just from German, meaning, I think it means before or antecedent. And so why scholars call it the Hamlet, I have no idea. But what it's referring to is the lost predecessor play of Shakespeare's Hamlet. That actually is the subject of the book that I'm almost done with. In my book, I call it Kidd's Hamlet because people have long thought that it probably was by Thomas Kidd. I devote a whole chapter in the book to showing that it almost certainly was written by Thomas Kidd. So in the book, I don't use the term Hamlet. I just say Kidd's Hamlet. It was written about 1589, and Shakespeare based his Hamlet on it. And then it just disappeared after Shakespeare's play.
Why are the portraits from Hamlet and Hamlet significant when exploring stage props for Elizabethan theater?
Well, typically when Hamlet is performed today, of course, Hamlet shows Gertrude miniatures. And the audience doesn't really get to see them. It could be anything. They could be holding a pebble in their hand. It's not anything the audience can see. But I think it's pretty clear that in both Kidd's Hamlet and in Shakespeare's, what they had on the stage were actual life-size portraits, or that is, how would you call them? Figures of the head. They wouldn't have been the whole standing figure. But the audiences could see those. And the reason that's significant is because they had to be painted. Somebody had to paint a portrait of both Claudius and King Hamlet, portraits of both of them, and make them look like the actors in character. Well, of course, in King Hamlet's case, he's a ghost, but you'd have to make him look like King Hamlet before King Hamlet became a ghost. And Claudius, of course, would have to look like the Claudius on the stage, who probably was the same actor, but they would have had different makeup or whatever. And that would have had to be represented in the portraits. And that means the portraits had to be painted. Somebody had to paint them, which again goes to the point that I think there was a lot more trouble and effort put into props than we realized. I did write an article several years ago in Review of English Studies in which I argued at some length that the many severed heads on the Elizabethan stage were actually carved in the likeness of the actors in their character. It might have just been of the actor, and then they made it up, put on the same makeup and hat that the actor was wearing, so the same bust could be reused. But again, if that's true, and I also wrote about it in the Oxford University Press blog because the blog was very interested in that question. So I extended the point there. So again, you have the situation where the acting companies went to the trouble to have a bust, a severed head of the actor carved, and then they would make it up and put on whatever jewelry or headdresses the person was wearing before they were beheaded, which goes again. I do think that properties were considerably more elaborate than we have typically assumed.
Why do you think we accept that masks were known to be elaborate, even hiring professional architectural designers like Inigo Jones to accomplish feats of great magnitude during performance, while theaters were assumed to have nothing but the power of dialogue to convey their story. What is it that gave theaters this reputation in antiquity?
Well, obviously we have better records of masks because the Royal Revels Office had to record all the money they spent to buy all the machinery and the properties. We don't, except for Henslow's properties list, we don't really have similar records by the acting companies. I guess scholars would also think that King James, of course, spent very lavishly on everything. So you could assume that, well, he spent lavishly on this, but the acting companies were more frugal. I am inclined to doubt that, as I've already said. Unlike a mask, the acting company, I mean, if you built something for a mask, it probably would be used only one time. Maybe the Revels Office would store it for possible future use, but it might not have any utility again. King James might not want to see the same effect twice. But for an acting company, if they went to the trouble to build an elaborate property, they would do it with the idea that it could be reused in other plays, even to the extent that they could have an author. I mean, they could have a playwright write a play that incorporates that property again, if it was particularly popular. So I guess that's why people would think that there are differences there. But the other part of your question, I think, also goes to, well, why do people think that there weren't elaborate properties on the Elizabethan stage? And that has been the assumption for a long time, that we just, that properties were very spare on the Elizabethan stage. And when you watch the performances of what are called original practices theater companies, I'll just say OP because that's what everybody calls them, they follow that practice. They use very few properties, no scenery. And so this has been the assumption. Why is that assumption made? Well, there's a bunch of reasons, I think. It used to be thought that plays took 2 hours and no more than 2 hours. They were just sort of like cut off when 2 hours was done. If you believe that, you would think they wouldn't have had time for elaborate properties or scenery because they'd have to zip through it to get through in 2 hours. But I showed in another article in 2010 in Shakespeare Quarterly that I don't think that 2 hour limit was true, that they could go up to 3 hours and a quarter. And I think by now, originally that article was greeted with great skepticism, but by now most people have come around to accept that conclusion. So that really isn't any longer a good basis for assuming the sparsity of properties and scenery. Other reasons were scholars tend to assume that the plays were staged the same way on tour as they were in London. And you could bring a wagon or two on tour, but you'd have to put all of your properties on there that you were going to use on the tour. And then the thinking is, well, they couldn't get that much on the wagons, so they couldn't have had very elaborate properties. I don't think much of that theory because I'm quite sure they did not stage the plays the same way on tour as they did in London. Now, as we've already discussed, every company had ascents and descents from the heavens and sitting on properties, eagles, thrones, and so forth. Well, you can't do that in a guild hall. That's not possible. So by definition, those plays couldn't have been staged the same way on tour as they were in London. So why do the properties have to be the same? Which leads to the last reason why I think scholars have clung to this belief. The dialogue in plays typically describes it clearly enough so that the audience can imagine the properties or the scenery. And that, of course, has led scholars to believe that, therefore, they weren't actually shown. My guess is the reason for that actually is the dialogue is there so that the play could be performed on tour. When they couldn't bring the scenery and couldn't bring the props. So I think there's been reasons for the assumption, but I don't think they're valid.
One of my favorite stories about the Globe Theatre is their use of a thunder machine. It was constructed in the upper levels of the playhouse with like a trough and a giant ball that would roll down it to create fake thunder for various productions. And Mike, if it's possible to create a fake thunder machine in the 16th century, would there have been other sound effects machines as well?
I suspect so, Cassidy. I mean, when you think of thunder machines, you of course are going to think of the opening of Tempest, because it specifically calls for thunder and lightning, which would also have involved fireworks. but also the sailors refer to the howling of the winds. So probably they had some system for making wind noises. And I would hardly be surprised if they had a way to make the sound of ocean waves to mimic the sound of a storm. If you could do all three things at once, you could make it seem like a pretty real storm. So yes, I think they probably did.
One of the most enduring and fascinating questions about Elizabethan staging has to be the dragon from Faustus. Now, you referred to this earlier, but we know from Henslow's record that an actual dragon was used. But frustratingly, he only lists one dragon in the notes themselves. Mike, does your research suggest that this would have been an actual dragon that got put on stage, or would this have been like a tapestry or some other background image?
Yeah, it would have been the dragon chariot, I think, that's referred to in the B text. Henslow wasn't always precise in his descriptions. I mean, he was making this inventory for his own use. As long as he knew what he was talking about, that was enough. So when a scholar is looking at the list, sometimes you're scratching your head. What does this mean? The B text of Faustus specifically calls for a dragon chariot, and I assume that that's what Henslow meant when he said one dragon. As I've said before, I think that dragon actually would have been suspended above the stage rather than placed on it. It would have come down. I mean, it would be suspended originally when they're flying over Europe and over Rome, but then when they arrive in Rome, then it would have been set down on the stage.
Are there examples of characters or scenes from Shakespeare's plays that have traditionally been thought to be purely imagined, as you mentioned, from the dialogue intended for the audience to just think it up as the dialogue's taking place on stage, that your research revealed could have actually been staged with elaborate props?
Oh, yeah. I think so. We've discussed Tempest, and there's lots of opportunities in Tempest to do elaborate staging if you wanted to. I would also, if I could travel back in time, I'd also go back and watch the original productions of Titus Andronicus. I mean, it's pretty gory, but I'd like to see how they actually accomplished cutting off Lavinia's hands and cutting out her tongue. I would assume that they actually showed that. I mean, the text really requires for it to be a physical thing. You couldn't really pretend that it was done when her hands are still on there. So that would be interesting too. But I have to see this. The play I would most like to see, if I could go back in time, would be Macbeth. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting things in Macbeth that could be staged if you wanted to do them. In 1611, for example, Simon Forman refers to, he went to see Macbeth, and he says Macbeth and Banquo rode through a wood, meaning they were riding through a forest. Now, I don't suppose they really had horses on the stage, but the wood probably was there. The forest probably was there. There's several trees in Henslow's inventory, and lots of plays require trees, so why couldn't you have several of them on the stage? And then, of course, Macbeth and Banquo encounter the three witches, and that's very interesting too, the staging of the witches, particularly because twice the witches, it says vanish. The stage directions say vanish. And Banquo and Macbeth discuss in the first scene, and then in the second scene, Macbeth discussing it to himself, that they vanish into the air, so that they don't go down the trap door if they're going to vanish into the air. And in the second time that they appear to Macbeth, the cauldron does go down through the trap door, because Macbeth says the cauldron is disappearing into the earth. But the witches don't. Again, they vanish into the air. Now, how did they vanish? There's an interesting question there. Well, Henslow has in his inventory a cloak for to go invisible. So, yes,
it's just like Harry Potter.
Like Harry Potter, except that these are actual physical people. So how do they go invisible? I'm imagining the cloak was made of black velvet, and they would drop down a black velvet background, and then you create some distraction off to the side, and then the three witches swirl around and put on this black velvet cloak, and then you really couldn't, it would be really hard to see them at that point. It would seem as if they had vanished. They'd have to disappear through some slit in the hanging, but that would be an interesting effect to see. And and of course, then there's Banquo's ghost, which sits in Macbeth's throne of all things. Would be interesting to see how they did that. At the end, of course, Macduff brings out Macbeth's head that gets to the point I was making earlier about, well, what was the nature of these heads? Typically, stage companies today will bring out a head in a bag, and Macduff says, here's the head of the tyrant. I'm just thinking that given everything else we know about severed heads and their staging on the Elizabethan stage, I doubt that's the way Shakespeare's company did it, the King's Men, of course, because Macbeth has been on the stage virtually the entire play. He's going to bring out his head and say, here's the head of the tyrant, and it's in a bag. That's not going to seem very believable, especially to audiences that are used to seeing severed heads not only on the stage, but real severed heads, because that's when they severed the heads of so-called traitors, they put them on pikes and put the pike on London Bridge so everybody could see it. I mean, just it's like a warning, don't be a traitor or your head will be here too. So they were accustomed to seeing real severed heads. And I have to imagine that they brought out Macbeth's head. It was Macbeth. You could recognize the actor wearing the makeup and that he was wearing on the stage. Macbeth would be a very interesting play to see staged if you could go back in time.
I know we would love to explore the stage magic further because it's just fascinating, all of the magic vanishing witches and the flying dragon chariots. And in addition to several of your articles that you've already mentioned, which we will link to in the show notes for today's episode, I wondered what some of your recommendations might be for books or resources we should look at if we want to learn more.
Well, that's a tough one. Most books about Elizabethan staging, Andy Gurr and then Andy and Mariko Ichikawa's book and Michael Hathaway's book, do discuss properties, but they say that they pretty much adhere to the usual thinking that properties were sparse. They use properties very sparingly, and if they mention scenery at all, they'll just say they didn't use scenery. Well, I think they did use scenery. So it's hard to recommend those books, but certainly they do discuss properties. So basically, the only actual book that discusses properties in a narrative in a way that I think actually is useful, at least as far as I'm aware, and I didn't mean to denigrate Marika or Andy's work at all. I mean, they're just saying what people typically think. But in terms useful for supporting the arguments that I'm making, is a book by Alan Barragona and John Leland called Shakespeare's Prop Room. And they go through all the plays performed by the Lord Chamberlain's Company and which then became the King's Company. And they discuss not only what appears in the stage directions, but what also is implied by the dialogue. The dialogue is, as we've discussed before, is a less clear indicator that properties actually were used on the stage. I've said I think the actual reason that dialogue describing things is there is so that they didn't have to bring the actual things when they were on tour. But Barragona and Leland do discuss in more imaginative ways the kind of properties and scenery that could be used. Apart from that, I mean, then you've got to go back to original materials. You'd want to look at Henslow's diary, at the properties lists in Henslow's diary. The standard edition is Reg Folks. If you can find it, the edition by Walter W. Gregg is very useful because Gregg has copious annotations there. Some of them have been since superseded by a subsequent scholarship, but still, it's always useful to go back and look to see what Gregg said. I mean, I think he wrote these books in the 1900s. I think, yeah, it was sometime around 1910. So it's pretty old, but Gregg was a very original thinking scholar, and he came up with a lot of ideas that I think are still valuable today. And then stage directions. Other than Henslow's properties list, the best indicators of properties that we know had to be there would be stage directions. And Alan Dessen and Leslie Thompson have a book called The Dictionary of Stage Directions. And there you can find, I mean, they amalgamate every stage direction in every play, and you can go through and see patterns in properties by going through the dictionary. And in addition to that, Martin Wiggins' Catalog of British Drama, this multi-volume, lists all the properties of each play. He goes through the plays play by play, and part of what he does is list all the properties that are called for in the stage directions. So that's a good resource as well. And then lastly, I'll just plug myself. I intend to write a long blog post on this subject and put it on the blog that I have on my website. The blog there discusses various topics that interest me I'm going to put a fairly lengthy discussion of this topic on the blog.
Which will include, I'm sure, much more information where you can go deeper. Mike, tell us what the URL is for that.
The URL, I don't know, but you get to the website. It's michaeljhirrel.com.
Excellent.
It can go mikehirrel.com works, and michaelhirrel.com works as well.
Well, we will link to Mike's blog in the show notes for today's episode, so you can be sure and find his full article all about this topic there. And I was also able to find Walter Gregg's annotated version of Henslow's diary available online as a PDF. And it was written in 1904, at least this edition that I found from the University of Waterloo. So I will link to that and all of the resources Mike's recommended for us today over in the show notes. Now, Mike, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
I don't know if I would bring the Bible. The Bible is at bottom a guide for how we live in society. What are our responsibilities to our fellow human beings, and what makes us a good person? On a deserted island, that wouldn't be all that useful. There is no society. I think I'd bring a book that was more about how does one find the resources to carry on and when you're alone. And that would be Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. The poor guy, he wanted to be a philosopher and a scholar, but he was the emperor of Rome, and he was forced to be a general because the Germans were behaving very badly on the Roman border. And he was up there in the cold and the rain, not able to do his scholarship and so forth. And he wrote the Meditations, which are very, very trenchant, I think, in thinking, how does one carry on? The Shakespeare. Yeah, I'd bring Shakespeare, but I'd have to train myself up. I'd have to train myself to think of it as entertainment rather than work.
Oh. Well, I don't know what to say about that.
My first instinct whenever I read anything by Shakespeare is I need to have a pencil and a notepad handy. But I'd have to. You wouldn't on a desert island. You couldn't do that. But certainly you could learn to enjoy them. They're fascinating. They're entertaining, and they're just, every time you read them, you think you just can't help but think, man, this is way more depth to this than I had ever realized before. I've read this passage 10 times, and I never even thought about this.
It's true. And I will say they come alive better when you perform them while you're reading them. So the trick is to act them out. And then that's when they really become entertainment. If nothing else, you end up laughing at your own acting skills when you do that. Of course, this could just be me.
Well, anybody would laugh at my acting skills. I can guarantee you that. And I think then the one other book, there's lots of candidates for that. But, I think the one other book I would take would be Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, because like Shakespeare, they're infinitely fascinating. They tell you a lot about humanity, and they're also entertaining.
Those are excellent choices for sure. We'll link to your desert island selection in the show notes for today. But what's next for you, Mike? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, first, I'm going to do the blog post that I said, and I'm going to discuss there in considerable detail why I think the Elizabethan acting companies, when they were in London, used rather elaborate props and scenery. And then when I finish that, I'll get back to my book, which I also mentioned. The book concerns Kidd's Hamlet, the predecessor play of Shakespeare's Hamlet. That is a lot of work, way more work than I had ever imagined would be necessary, but I'm almost done, finally.
That sounds very exciting. Please keep us informed about when this becomes available. I know we'll love to read that when it comes out. Thank you, Mike, so much for being here and talking with us about props and scenery in Shakespeare's England. This has been really fun.
Well, you're certainly welcome, Cassidy. It's a pleasure to be here. I do tend to go on, but it's a subject that fascinates me.
To join in on this conversation with your thoughts about props and scenery for 16th century playhouses, be sure to check out today's show notes. Not only will you find a place to leave your comments, but there's extra history packed in there, including links to Henslow's diary and Walter Gregg's annotations that you can read for free. Find all of this stuff you need to explore further into props and scenery from Shakespeare's England at CassidyCash.com/episode 97. That's CassidyCash.com/EP97. When I first started studying Shakespeare, especially as an American, where the English language is very different on this side of the pond than where Shakespeare was writing, I often mispronounced some of the words that you find in the plays. Like originally I said Gloucester instead of Gloucester. Well, that's why I downloaded Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app. It's an easy-to-use, straightforward app that you can download to your phone or tablet on iTunes as well as Google Play. And it lets you search any word from Shakespeare, and then it tells you exactly how to say it with a playable audio guide built right in. Audio Shakespeare Pronunciation app is like having a professional voice coach that you can carry in your pocket. Explore all the features of this app and download it right now at CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's CassidyCash.com/Shakespeare app. That's it for this week. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.